The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Anderson Cooper adjusted his navy blue blazer one final time. The CNN anchor had covered wars, natural disasters, and political scandals, but today felt different. Today, he was about to sit down with members of the British royal family for what was supposed to be an exclusive interview about their upcoming charity initiatives. Anderson had spent weeks preparing for this moment. His team had submitted questions in advance, gone through multiple security clearances, and followed every protocol demanded by the palace press office. The interview was scheduled to take place in the Blue Drawing Room, a stunning chamber adorned with silk wallpaper and priceless artwork that had witnessed countless historic moments. As Anderson walked through the palace corridors, flanked by his small camera crew, he couldn't help but notice the stern expressions of the royal guards stationed at every corner. These weren't the ceremonial guards tourists photograph outside the gates. These were the real deal, highly trained security personnel, whose job was to protect the royal family at all costs. The lead guard, a tall man with piercing blue eyes and an immaculate uniform, stepped forward as Anderson's team approached the interview location. His name tag read, Captain Williams, and everything about his demeanor suggested he took his job very seriously. He had served in the British Army for 15 years before joining the Royal Protection Unit, and his reputation for being thorough was well known among palace staff. "Mr. Cooper," Captain Williams said in a crisp British accent, "I need to remind you of the agreed-upon guidelines for today's interview. You have 30 minutes, and you must stick to the pre-approved questions. Any deviation from the established protocol will result in immediate termination of the interview." Anderson nodded, though something in the guard's tone made him slightly uneasy. Captain Williams took another step closer to Anderson, his military bearing unmistakable as he positioned himself between the journalist and the royal family members. The decorative grandfather clock in the corner of the Blue Drawing Room seemed to tick louder in the sudden silence, each second stretching like an eternity as everyone waited to see who would blink first in this unexpected standoff. "Mr. Cooper," the captain said, his voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I am not going to repeat myself. You will either return to the approved questions or this interview will be terminated immediately. These are not negotiable terms." Anderson could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His entire career had been built on moments exactly like this one, where the choice was between taking the safe path or pursuing the truth regardless of the consequences. He glanced at his producer Sarah, who was frantically making hand gestures from behind the camera, clearly trying to signal him to back down and salvage what remained of the interview. But Anderson Cooper hadn't become one of America's most respected journalists by backing down when things got uncomfortable. He had reported from war zones, confronted corrupt politicians, and challenged some of the most powerful people in the world. The idea of being silenced by protocol in what was supposed to be a free press interview went against everything he believed in as a journalist. "Captain Williams," Anderson said, his voice steady but firm, "I understand you have a job to do. But so do the American people, and frankly the British people as well. Expect their journalists to ask real questions, not just read from a script prepared by Palace public relations staff. This isn't a promotional video. It's supposed to be journalism." The royal family members exchanged increasingly worried glances. They had participated in hundreds of interviews over the years, but none had ever deteriorated quite like this one. The usual smooth professionalism that characterized their public appearances was rapidly giving way to something much more unpredictable and potentially embarrassing. Captain Williams' face had turned a shade of red that almost matched the royal crimson carpet beneath their feet. Anderson slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and measured as he faced Captain Williams across the now electric atmosphere of the Blue Drawing Room. The CNN anchor's years of experience in high-pressure situations served him well as he maintained his composure despite the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding around him. "Captain Williams," Anderson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had interviewed world leaders and wasn't easily intimidated. I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You're ending this interview and having me escorted out because I asked a legitimate question about public spending? Is that really the message you want to send to the international media? The captain's military posture remained rigid, but Anderson could see something flickering in his eyes. Perhaps it was the recognition that this confrontation was being filmed and would likely be seen by millions of people around the world. Perhaps it was the awareness that his heavy-handed response might actually create a bigger public relations disaster than the original question would have caused. But Captain Williams had made his decision, and his military training didn't allow for backing down once a line had been drawn. "Mr. Cooper," he replied, his voice still stern but now carrying a hint of uncertainty, "you were given clear guidelines before this interview began. You chose to violate those guidelines despite repeated warnings. The consequences are entirely your responsibility." Anderson's camera operator Mike continued filming, capturing every word and gesture of this extraordinary confrontation. He had covered enough major news events to understand that they were witnessing something that would likely be analyzed and discussed for years to come. The footage they were capturing might become one of the most watched royal-related videos in internet history. The royal family members remained seated but clearly uncomfortable, caught between their desire to maintain diplomatic relations with the American media and their obligation to support the security protocols that govern their lives. Their silence spoke volumes about the impossible position they found themselves in. Anderson made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. Instead of arguing further or allowing himself to be escorted out quietly, he turned. The tension in the blue drawing room reached a breaking point as Anderson made his most decisive move yet. Rather than waiting for the guards to escort him out, he stood up straighter and addressed the camera, with the kind of authoritative presence that had made him one of television's most trusted journalists. "What's happening here today is bigger than just one interview," Anderson declared, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate room. "This is about whether legitimate questions can be asked of public institutions, or whether protocol and tradition are more important than accountability and transparency." Captain Williams' face had moved beyond red into a deeper shade of purple. His military training had prepared him for many situations, but dealing with a defiant American journalist who refused to be intimidated was testing every ounce of his professional restraint. The situation was spiraling beyond anything covered in palace security protocols. "Mr. Cooper," the captain said, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge, "you have 10 seconds to turn off that camera and leave these premises voluntarily, or I will have you removed by force." This is not a negotiation. But Anderson had crossed his own Rubicon. Years of reporting from conflict zones and confronting powerful people had taught him that sometimes the most important stories came from moments when institutions showed their true nature under pressure. He wasn't about to waste this opportunity. "Captain Williams," Anderson replied, maintaining eye contact with the increasingly furious guard, "I want you to think very carefully about what you're about to do. You're representing one of the world's most respected institutions, and right now, millions of people are watching how that institution handles a simple question about public accountability." The royal family members looked mortified. What had started as a routine promotional interview had become a public relations nightmare that was being broadcast live to Anderson's audience. They could see their carefully maintained public image being damaged with every passing second of this confrontation. Mike, the camera operator, continued filming despite the increasingly threatening presence of the palace guards. His professional experience told him that this footage would be historically significant, regardless of how the immediate confrontation resolved itself. He had covered enough major news events to recognize when he was witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Captain Williams finally lost the last of his composure. "Right, that's it," he barked, gesturing aggressively to the two guards. "Remove them now. Use whatever force is necessary." The guards stepped forward, but Anderson held his ground. "Are you really going to have me physically dragged out of here for asking about public spending?" he asked, his voice remaining calm despite the escalating threat. "Because if you are," I want everyone watching to see exactly how this institution treats journalists who ask uncomfortable questions. The standoff had reached its climax. Captain Williams realized that any physical confrontation would be captured on camera and broadcast around the world, potentially causing irreparable damage to the royal family's reputation. But he had committed himself to a course of action and couldn't back down without losing all authority. Sarah, Anderson's producer, made a crucial decision. She stepped forward with her hands raised in a gesture of peace, speaking directly to Captain Williams with the diplomatic skill that had made her successful in international journalism. "Captain Williams," she said, her voice professionally calm, "we're going to leave voluntarily to avoid any further escalation. But I want you to understand that this entire confrontation is going to be part of our news report. The way this has been handled will be the story, not just the original interview." Her words hit Captain Williams like a splash of cold water. He suddenly realized that his aggressive response had transformed a minor question about royal spending into a major, international story about press freedom and institutional transparency. The palace's public relations team would be furious. When they discovered how badly this situation had been mismanaged, Anderson began packing up his materials, but he wasn't finished making his point. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, speaking one final time to his camera, "what you've witnessed here today is what happens when institutions prioritize control over accountability. We came here to discuss charitable work, but instead we've learned something much more significant about how some organizations respond to legitimate questions." Captain Williams wanted to stop Anderson from making this final statement, but he realized that any further intervention would only make the situation worse. The damage was already done, and additional confrontation would only provide more ammunition for Anderson's eventual news report. The guards flanked Anderson's team as they gathered their equipment, but the atmosphere had shifted slightly. Captain Williams had regained enough of his composure to recognize that he needed to minimize further damage rather than escalate the confrontation even more. As Anderson and his crew walked toward the exit, followed by the stern-faced guards, the royal family members remained in their chairs, clearly stunned by how quickly their routine interview had transformed into an international incident. They knew that this story would dominate news cycles for days, if not weeks. Anderson paused at the doorway and turned back one final time. "Thank you for your time," he said with professional courtesy, as if nothing unusual had happened. "I hope in the future we can have a more productive conversation about the important issues facing the British people." With that, he walked out of Buckingham Palace, leaving behind a room full of people trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened to their superiors and to the world media that would inevitably pick up this story within hours. Within hours of Anderson Cooper's explosive departure from Buckingham Palace, the story had become the lead headline on news networks around the world. The footage of his confrontation with Captain Williams spread across social media platforms like wildfire, with millions of viewers sharing, commenting, and debating what they had witnessed in the Blue Drawing Room. Anderson sat in his London hotel room that evening, reviewing the footage with his producer Sarah and considering how to present the story to his viewers. The raw emotion and tension of the confrontation was even more striking when watched back, and both journalists knew they had captured something unprecedented in the usually controlled world of royal media interactions. "This is going to change everything," Sarah said, scrolling through the flood of messages and interview requests that had been pouring in since news of the incident broke. "Every major news organization in the world wants to talk to us about what happened in there." Back at Buckingham Palace, Captain Williams found himself in the most difficult position of his distinguished career. The palace communications team had called an emergency meeting to discuss damage control strategies, and the captain's aggressive handling of the situation was being questioned at the highest levels of the royal household. The palace press secretary, Margaret Thornton, paced nervously around her office as she tried to craft a statement that would minimize the public relations disaster. How did a routine charity interview turn into an international incident about press freedom? She asked rhetorically, knowing that Captain Williams' heavy-handed response had created exactly the kind of controversy the royal family worked so hard to avoid. Meanwhile, the royal family members who had been present during the interview were dealing with their own crisis. They understood that their silence during the confrontation would be interpreted as either approval of Captain William's actions or inability to control their own security staff. Either interpretation was damaging to their carefully cultivated public image. Anderson's report aired that night on CNN to record-breaking viewership. The footage of his confrontation with Captain Williams became some of the most watched royal-related content in years, but for all the wrong reasons. Anderson presented the story with his characteristic professionalism, allowing the footage to speak for itself while